Chapter 13. Fire. What'd I tell you?" the man cried. "The tracks lead right to this here woodpile." He laid one hand on a log just inches above Pete's head. But the snow camouflaged the boy so well that in the darkness, the man missed seeing him. "I suppose it was one of those Hollister kids and we scared him away," Stocky said. "Let's get back inside before we freeze." He laughed. "It'd be too bad to get sick and not be able to find Travers Nelson by the time that race starts." Pete pricked up his ears. Why was it so important for these men to find their teacher's twin brother before the big race started? He hoped the men would reveal more, but both remained silent as they entered the cabin and slammed the door. Pete carefully wiggled out of the woodpile and headed for home. Suddenly a new thought about the Greeble brothers came to him. "I wonder if they could be policemen," the boy said to himself. "Maybe Travers Nelson did something wrong." Arriving at the Hollisters' log cabin, Pete told the others what he had overheard and his new theory about them. Pam quickly sprang to the defense of her teacher's twin. "I'm sure he didn't do anything wrong," she insisted. "Miss Nelson said that her brother was very sensitive. He ran away because of the bad men who made him lose the race." Mr. Hollister laid a hand on his daughter's arm and said, "What Pete says might be true. And I advise you children to have a good time and stop worrying about the Greeble brothers. I learned from Gramp today that they came here with very high recommendations." Pete looked at his sister, then shifted his glance to his dad. Which one was right? Pam's trust in people was usually well-founded. Besides, Mr. Stamp had said Travers Nelson was a fine person. Pete hoped that this was the case, and that the Greebles were not policemen. Next morning, the children dressed for their visit to the Canadians' country school. At 8 o'clock, Gramp Hollister drove up in the sleigh. In it were 3 pairs of snowshoes. Gramp told Pete and Ricky to bring theirs. "This is the way youngsters up here go to school in the wintertime," he said. When they were ready to leave, the children waved to their parents and off they drove. The bells on Gallant's harness jingled merrily. In a few moments they were in front of the school, a small white building that looked something like a little church without a steeple. A young woman stood in the doorway swinging a large bell in her hand. Pupils, climbing the steps, stopped to kick the snow off their boots and remove their hats before they entered. The Hollisters heard one little boy, about Ricky's age, remark, "I say, what a big family of kids that's moved to Froston." Ricky grinned at him. "We're just visitors," he said. "We're from the United States." "We were expecting you," said the young woman, smiling. "Pierre phoned me. He'll be a little late. I'm Miss Johnson. Will you follow me?" She requested them to put their coats, caps, and snowshoes on hooks just inside the door. Following her inside, the Hollisters found that there was only one classroom, heated by a little round coal stove, which stood near the back on the left. The desks were of various sizes for the different age groups. When Miss Johnson reached the front of the room, she turned to the pupils and introduced the visitors, asking each one to give his first name. Then she said, "Please make yourselves at home and sit wherever you like." Pete and Pam seated themselves with some of the older children, while Holly, Ricky, and Sue found places with the younger pupils. The morning session began. First, Miss Johnson would teach one group of children, while the others worked quietly. Then she would leave them and go on to the next grade. Presently, she told the Hollisters this was the day of the week when the older children studied United States history and affairs. Perhaps the visitors would like to take over. "Oh, I know a lot about our country," Ricky exclaimed proudly. Miss Johnson smiled. "Suppose you tell us about your own state, then," she said. Ricky did the best he could, saying it had lots of factories that made just about everything. Then Pete and Pam added more information. Miss Johnson next asked Holly to tell about Lincoln School activities. The little girl mentioned the various clubs and said Pam was president of the pet club. "That's how we found out Pam's teacher is the sister of Mr. Nelson, who lost the race last year," she said. The pupils were amazed to hear this. All of them knew about Fluff and hoped to see the lovely dog race again this year. None of them could offer any suggestion as to where the man and his Eskimo dogs might be. "And now," said Miss Johnson, turning to Sue, "what can you tell us about the place you live in?" Sue had been sitting quietly, making pictures with the youngest group. "We have lots of snow, too," the little girl replied. "There was a big blizz." "She means blizzard," Pam said, and the children laughed. "Anyhow," Sue went on, "nobody could go to school, so we came up here to eat turkey with my grandmother." This remark led to a talk by Miss Johnson about Thanksgiving, which is not celebrated in Canada. When she mentioned the good things usually eaten with the turkey, Pierre, who had come in a few minutes before, declared it made him very hungry. At recess, all the children except Sue, who decided to stay in and draw, put on their caps and snowsuits. One of the older boys tossed a couple of logs into the stove, and the pupils dashed outside to play, followed by the teacher. A few minutes later, Sue raced out the door, calling, "Ricky, Pete, come here quick, the stove's making a fire." At first her brothers thought Sue was fooling, but when they noticed a look of alarm on her face, they rushed back into the classroom. The top of a desk was in flames. Papers on it had been ignited by sparks flying through the open door of the stove. Without hesitation, Pete slammed the door shut. Then the Hollister brothers dashed outdoors and grabbed up handfuls of snow. By this time, Miss Johnson had run in and was trying to beat out the flames with a shovel. Between this and the snow, the fire was soon extinguished. John, the boy who had put the logs in the stove, was aghast. He had closed the door, but evidently not tightly enough, and it had swung open. Miss Johnson advised him to be more careful in the future, and praised the Hollisters for their quick wits. "We're lucky to have had you visit us today," she said. "If it hadn't been for Sue and you boys, there might have been a bad fire in the school." At lunchtime, the Hollisters said goodbye to Miss Johnson and all the pupils. Since they planned to walk back to Snowflake Camp on snowshoes, they took a shortcut, which Pierre pointed out. It took them through a lane to a side road. They had not gone far on this road when Ricky spied an old deserted farmhouse ahead. Always looking for adventure, the boy trudged into the grounds and opened the door of an abandoned barn behind the main building. "Hey kids, come here quick," he shouted. "See what I found." His brother and sisters raced over. Ricky pointed to a pile of straw on the floor. Lying in the middle of it was an Eskimo dog puppy. "Oh, how adorable," Pam cried, reaching down to stroke its fluffy fur. The other children got down on their haunches, surrounding the beautiful buff puppy. Holly reached out her hand to pet him. "Oh dear, I'm afraid the poor little thing will catch cold," she said tenderly. Pam chuckled when she heard this. "I don't think so. Eskimo dogs can stand very low temperatures," she replied. "Let's take him home," Ricky proposed. "Oh no," Pam said. "I'm sure his mother will return for him." On the way to their cabin, Ricky kept talking about the puppy, and late that afternoon his curiosity to see if the dog was still there got the better of him. "Pam," he said, "please come back with me and look at him." "All right, I will," his sister agreed, "but don't forget we're not bringing him home." Ricky grinned, but said nothing. The other children joined him, and Pam went in their trek back to see the barn. It was not far from Snowflake Camp. As they approached the door, Ricky said, "Listen, hear that whining? The mother didn't come back for her puppy after all." He slid the barn door open and stared in amazement. Then the boy shouted, "Yikes! Now there are two of them!" "But how did this one get here?" Holly cried. Pete grinned. If his mother didn't bring him, then it's another mystery we'll have to solve." As Pam stroked the puppies, she said no doubt they were from the same litter. She lifted them off their straw bed, and the younger children watched as the puppies waddled about. Meanwhile, Pete looked around for dog tracks to see where the mother had gone, but could find none in front of the barn. In the rear, however, he could see prints coming and going through a hole between two clapboards. He followed the footprints for a distance, but they became lost where the wind had scattered the snow around. The boy turned back and joined his brother and sisters. "Let's stop at Gram and Gramps and tell them about the pups," he proposed. "Maybe they know where the dogs came from." But both grandparents said they knew nothing about them. "Why do you suppose the mother dog left them in the barn?" Pam asked. "There might be danger where the pups were living," Gram replied. "Dogs always see to it that their puppies are safe." Pam said that she was going to visit the barn first thing in the morning to see if the mother dog was there. Then maybe she would lead the girl to her old home and Pam could find out what had happened. "Maybe Pierre knows about them," Holly suggested. The boy was still working at the camp, and the children hurried off to ask him. But Pierre had not heard of any dog in the neighborhood who had had pups recently. Next morning, Pete and Pam were up early and met in the kitchen. Their mother gave permission for them to visit the barn, and they set off at once toward the abandoned farmhouse. Approaching the barn, they heard the whining of the pups. This time it seemed to be louder. Pete opened the door and Pam peered inside. "Look at this, Pete!" she exclaimed. Instead of 2 puppies, now there were 3.